We're gonna see how fast I can talk today because there's a lot to get through and I'm extremely excited for this one. Hello, my dears. My name is Mariana and welcome to my channel. So today I want to talk to you about something that is so important to me. I've talked about tarot on this channel a lot, and I've talked about mysticism a lot, but I've never really talked about them together, which is crazy. So today, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. And if you haven't yet, you might wanna check out this video on mysticism and what mysticism really is, why it's important to live a mystical life. And if you also haven't yet, you might wanna check out this video about other studies to really deepen your tarot practice, because I think as a tarotist, it's essential to make sure you're being educated and you're going deep. But today, I really want to talk about 3 ways that we can approach the tarot from a more mystical lens. Because I think we all know that the tarot is a mystical tool. We look at the cards and we get that shiver of knowledge that there is something really profound, really beautiful going on that we absolutely want to dive into, to fully embrace. But when we look at the cards, even if we start to get that tingle, we don't necessarily know what it means, where to even go with that call to follow the mystical path. And honestly, so many of us witches call ourselves modern mystics, and it's true, but we don't really know what we mean by that. Mysticism is one of those impossibly difficult things to describe. It is equally based in wisdom and experience. It is the ecstatic coming together of knowledge and body. The mystical experience is absolutely one founded in love, in the unity between our mortal souls and the soul of the world, of the divine itself. When we think about what mysticism is, we want to think about it as being the ecstatic connection, communion with God, source, whatever you want to call it. But we also want to think about it as something that is going to guide us deeper into our own experience of ourselves, towards the ultimate goal of individuation, the goal of wholeness, being thoroughly who you are. And I really believe that is the mystical path. That is the point of it all. And the tarot is absolutely the perfect tool to use to help ourselves get there. But it really requires dedication. It requires learning. You can't just say I'm a mystic and that's just true. If you want to be a mystic, you really have to dive into the paths of the mystics that have come before us. You have to learn the secrets that our ancestors knew so that we can really adapt them into our own practice, into our own lives, and make sense of them for ourselves. And if this is something that absolutely lights you afire, like it lights me afire, I invite you to check out my next seminar series about the mystical quests of the major arcana, about finding your path to the mystical revelations that are in the tarot, finding your way to the individuated self, to who you really are, and how you can fully embrace really becoming that inner mystic. We are going to explore Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and mythology or mythopoetics to really understand how the tarot can guide us to the mystical revelations it's meant to. They take place over 3 Sundays from July to August 2021, and there is a really sweet discount if you buy the whole class package. If you don't want to and you're just interested in one of these topics, you can just buy the seminar to that one itself. So there's a lot of different ways to engage, and I just really hope I see you there. All right, on with the show. So today I'm also going to talk about the 3 most direct pathways to the mysticism of the major arcana: Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and mythology. So obviously I can't talk about all of these things in one video, so we're just going to touch on each of them and see maybe we can draw to get us started. So let's start with Hermeticism. Hermeticism is an almost impossible thing to define. I have tried this several times. Sometimes I'm almost okay at it, and most of the time I just don't make any sense, so hopefully that's not this time. Basically, Hermeticism is this ancient, often closed practice of really discerning how we can align the microcosm and the macrocosm, the cosmos and the human person. So Hermeticism comes from several different traditions. It's kind of this amalgamation of reflection and material, but mostly it comes from the Hellenistic period, and it comes from ancient Greece, North Africa, a whole slew of places. You may have heard of the Emerald Tablet, which is this ancient text that we have that describes the Hermetic practices, the Hermetic principles that existed in the ancient times. But because we're talking about the tarot, we want to talk about Hermeticism as it was developed in the Middle Ages, which is when the tarot was really born. Now, I know there's a lot of debate about how the tarot came to be and the history of the tarot and blah, 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 and we're not even going to pretend to get into that at all today. But basically, in the late Middle Ages, we started to see the creation of the tarot, and it was absolutely inspired by different things from around the world. Some scholars think it may have come from the Romani tradition, some think it may have come from Egypt. There could be a lot of possibilities, but the tarot that we know today came out of medieval Europe. And at this time period, there was this really extraordinary renaissance of Hermetic ideas. They were reclaiming things like astrology and alchemy and occultism. And they were adapting these ancient Hermetic principles into their renaissance of ideas of mystical wisdom. And so the tarot that came from this time period was absolutely in communication with all of these ideas floating around. And we know that instinctively when we look at the tarot. We see the moon and we see the Hierophant and we see death, and we know that there is something secret, something really special, something deeply spiritual about these cards. Rider-Waite, the intellectual creator of the rider-waite tarot, was very familiar with these Hermetic ideas, and he adapted them very specifically into his revisioning of the cards. For example, we can see direct reference to the Cabbala through the High Priestess, and we can see death not just as, transformation, but as the alchemical principle of dissolution, of the burning away of all that does not serve. So when we study Hermeticism, when we really get into these different occult and secret, mysterious practices, all of a sudden we're illuminated to the deeper realities that the cards are trying to communicate. It creates philosophical windows to glimpse into the mystical worlds that exist in the cards, and our task is to dive into. So attached to Hermeticism is the next school of thought I really want to jump into, which is Kabbalah. Now, we have to kind of get on the table that Kabbalah is an active path of spiritual transformation, of spiritual work that happens in the Jewish community still today. It is not just something that we can reclaim from the past. It is very much alive, is very much practiced. Now, I am a person of Jewish descent, and I have some relationship with Kabbalah. I've taken classes, I've read books, but I am in no way claiming to be an expert. It's not necessarily something that is part of my daily practice, and I just want to get that on the table because we have to be really sensitive when we're talking about these practices that are still very much used, that are still very much alive. We don't want to appropriate them carelessly or recklessly. We want to be deeply thoughtful. That being said, we really can't talk about the tarot without talking about Kabbalah, because at that time period that the tarot was created, and especially in the Thoth versions and the Rider-Waite, Kabbalah is a central principle. It's a central school of thought to understanding how we can really envision these cards. Now, Kabbalah is another really hard thing to describe. I'm trying. Kabbalah is essentially the study of how to get to God. A few years ago, I had the absolute privilege of going to Israel and visiting the city of Tzfat, which is one of the most mystical cities. It's really like a heart of Kabbalah in the world. And I remember trying to ask people, what is Kabbalah? How would you describe it? And I got absolutely no answers that made any sense to me. And it was really interesting because for all I had read about Kabbalah, actually asking the people who practiced, I was even more confused because it's such an intuitive experience, but also deeply based in knowledge and study. Essentially, the way we want to think about Kabbalah is that we want to look at the different pathways to God, the different ways of contemplation of God, so that we can really live divine lives. Now, the most important thing when we're talking about the tarot and the Kabbalah is to look at the tree of life. Now, on the tree of life, there are 10 sephirot, and these are the different principles that we want to think about when we contemplate the divine. Tarot scholars really clearly match up these 10 emanations, experiences of the divine, with the 10 minor arcana of the tarot. And in between these 10 sephirot, there are 22 pathways, which obviously correlates to the 22 major arcana. So for example, just quickly pointing to the path of justice. Justice is that pathway that sits between two sephirot, severity and mercy. And just even contemplating that, there is so much to be illuminated. Because when we think of justice, when we think what justice really is, it's the ability to discern how we must interact with the judgments we have to make in the world. Do we choose the path of severity, of harshness, which is sometimes necessary? Or do we choose the path of mercy, of empathy? And looking at justice in this way, between mercy and severity, is just such a perfect summation of what the energy of justice is really about. So if you really want to dive into these divine messages of the major arcana, looking at Kabbalah, looking at these different points on the tree and these pathways between them is such a gorgeous practice. It is so illuminating. So even if you're not a practicing Kabbalist or you're not of the Jewish tradition, I think it's still worth reading these books that discuss it and what it's really trying to bring to the cards. All right, finally, we're going to talk about mythology and mythopoetics. Now, this might be something that you don't automatically think as being a mystical practice, but I really think it is. When we think about mythology, we're thinking about archetypes, and archetypes are the experience of the divine. They're our connection to the collective unconscious within that connects all of humanity, and that is at the heart of the mystical experience. When we're on the mystical path, we're trying to not only find the self within that is our wholeness, but we have to bind to the self without, the self that is in the divine. So I think for understanding mythology as a mystical practice, we want to understand what are the archetypes. And that's a whole nother video. Check that one out. But basically, the archetypes are these forms that exist in the collective unconscious, this communal space of unconsciousness, of existence that we all share and participate in. Now, traditionally, you might think of the archetypes as being like the hero and the princess and the villain, and these are all expressions of archetypes, but maybe not the archetype in and of itself. These are costumes that the archetypes might wear, but beyond that, there's a deeper essence to them. The villain is the shadow, the princess is the inner spiritual maiden, and the hero is the ego itself. So when we look at the mythologies of the world, we can broaden them out from just these classic stories to really telling this archetypal journey of how we get from where we are to where we're meant to be. So much of the work around mythology and mysticism really comes out of the genius mind of Joseph Campbell and in his work around the hero's journey. If you haven't heard about the hero's journey, go just Google it right now. There's probably 10,000 videos out there for you to watch. It's just such a fascinating thing. I obviously always recommend reading Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is the book that is all about what the hero's journey is. But in essence, the hero's journey is this story that's been replayed countless times in the world of the hero who starts in his ordinary life just a simple person and somehow becomes what Joseph Campbell called the master of two worlds. Now, as the master of two worlds, the hero is not only fully embracing himself, but also fully embracing the divine within. Now, Joseph Campbell laid out this really fantastic journey for the hero, the archetypes that he has to encounter on his way. And if we look at that and combine that with the idea of mythopoetics, we get this extremely beautiful mystical path for us to take. Mythopoetics was actually a term made popular by Tolkien, who's the writer of Lord of the Rings and my favorite thing of all time. But essentially, mythopoetics is the craft of creating your own mythology. And this is exactly what we can do when we're looking at mythology through a mystical lens. We can look at the different stages of the journey and use the tarot to illuminate what archetypes we're experiencing in those stages. By binding the archetypes of the tarot to the mythical paths and the mythopoetic practice, all of a sudden we get really dropped down into the mystical experience of our lives. It's less intellectual, it's less about understanding God and understanding all of this kind of brainy stuff we can get really easily lost in. It's really about just pulling cards and asking, what is the call I'm drawn to? Who is the guardian keeping me from the revelation I know that I need? So we can use these archetypes to really give us insight into what our life mythology even is, because we have to mythologize our lives in order to see ourselves as the hero on the journey of individuation, of becoming the master of those two worlds. That is being on the path of the mystic. That is experiencing your life not just as daily living, but as trying to get closer to God. There is no better tool, in my opinion, to really explore these different topics than the tarot. And there's no better topics, in my opinion, to really understand the tarot. Again, if this interested you, I am going to be diving really deep into it in my seminar series. We're going to not just be talking about the ideas themselves, but looking at the cards one by one, looking at each of the 22 major arcana and really understanding them in these three mystical contexts. So it is going to be really educational, really deepening, and a really profound experience. And I am just so excited to see you there, and I hope I do. If you haven't yet, subscribe. If you haven't yet, follow me on Instagram and check me out on Patreon so you can get discounts to things like my seminars, which would just be so nice, wouldn't it? Yeah, and thank you for your brains and your hearts and your deep inner mystics, and have a beautiful, meaningful day. I'm a really big Lord of the Rings geek, if you couldn't tell. Does that make me cooler?